A chilling wind howled across the plains, but this wasn't just any storm. This was the kind of wind that carried secrets, the kind that smelled of rain and desperation. For Sarah O'Connell, a widow with two hungry kids and a farm on the verge of turning to dust, it was a sound she knew all too well, the sound of the world trying to break her. Little did she know, this storm was about to bring something else to her doorstep, a dying man, a man whose secrets were as dark and dangerous as the Texas night. And what she did next wasn't just a simple act of kindness. It was a choice that would throw her family into a deadly game where the only prize was survival. The wind clawed at the walls of her small cabin, a mournful cry that echoed the emptiness in her heart. 2 years. 2 years since the fever took her husband John, leaving her with a mountain of debt and a homestead that was fighting a losing battle against the dust. The well was low, the corn was withered, and hope was a currency she could no longer afford. Mama, a small voice cut through the storm's roar. It was her daughter, 7-year-old Clara, clutching a worn rag doll, her big blue eyes, John's eyes, wide with fear. It sounds angry, Mama. Sarah knelt, forcing a smile she didn't feel. The sky is just having a tantrum, sweet girl. It'll tire itself out. A crash of thunder shook the cabin, and Clara buried her face in her mother's skirt. Sarah held her tight, her own heart hammering against her ribs. She wasn't just afraid of the storm. She was afraid of the coming winter, of the dwindling food, of the gnawing hunger that never seemed to leave them. Her son, Liam, 10 years old and already carrying the weight of the world on his small shoulders, sat at the table, trying to fix a broken strap from his father's saddle. He was trying to be brave for them, and that was the cruelest burden of all. Liam, help me bar the door, she said gently. Together, they slid the heavy wooden bar into place, a flimsy shield against the fury outside. The rain came down in sheets, the wind screaming like a banshee. The world outside their tiny cabin had disappeared into a violent, churning darkness. Sarah gathered her children onto the worn mattress in the corner, her voice a fragile lullaby against the storm's symphony. She sang of green pastures and a world so far from their reality it might as well have been a fairy tale. Hours crawled by. The children slept, but Sarah lay awake, every nerve on edge. And that's when she heard it. A sound that wasn't the storm. A faint, desperate cry, almost swallowed by the wind. She froze. Had she imagined it? There it was again, closer this time. A human voice, raw with pain. Her first instinct was to ignore it. The world outside was dangerous. John had always warned her to trust no one. But the cry came again, a long, agonizing moan that pierced right through the walls of the cabin and into her heart. It was the sound of someone dying. She looked at her sleeping children, their innocent faces bathed in the dim lantern light. What kind of person would she be if she just let someone die on her doorstep? With a heart pounding like a drum, she crept to the door. She hesitated, her hand hovering over the bar. This was a terrible risk, but she couldn't live with the alternative. Taking a deep breath, she slid the bar back. The wind tore the door from her hand, slamming it open with a crash. And there, lying in the mud just a few feet away, was a man. He was sprawled face down, a crumpled heap of soaked leather and dark fabric. For a terrifying second, she thought he was dead. "Stay inside, Liam," she yelled, her voice sharp with a terror she was trying to hide. "Bar the door behind me, and don't open it for anyone." Gathering every last shred of her courage, she stepped out into the raging storm. The mud sucked at her boots as she knelt beside him. "Mister, can you hear me?" A low groan was his only answer. He was alive. Adrenaline surged through her. She had to get him inside. He was a big man, heavy with muscle, and it was a struggle just to move him. "Liam, I need your help!" She screamed over the wind. The door creaked open, and Liam rushed to her side. Together, mother and son, they strained, pulling the unconscious man inch by agonizing inch over the threshold. They collapsed onto the floor, gasping for breath. The storm shut out, but a new unknown danger now trapped inside with them. In the flickering lantern light, she finally got a good look. This was no drifter. His clothes, though torn and caked in mud, were made of fine material. His boots were expensive. A silver-buckled belt cinched a trim waist, and a fine leather gun belt, its holster empty, was slung low on his hips. His face was strong-jawed and handsome, though pale with pain. A nasty gash on his forehead bled sluggishly, and a deeper wound on his side stained his shirt a dark, alarming crimson. But what truly stole her breath was the ring on his right hand, an intricate silver serpent with glittering emeralds for eyes. It was a symbol of a wealth she couldn't even imagine. "Mama, who is he?" Clara whispered, her eyes wide with fear. "He's hurt," Sarah said, her voice steadier than she felt. "We're going to help him." She sent Liam for their meager medical supplies, a few rags, whiskey, a needle and thread. As she began to clean the man's wounds, tearing strips from one of their few clean sheets, she couldn't help but wonder who he was. What was a man like this doing out here, in the middle of a storm, with an empty holster? She carefully cut away the fabric of his shirt to expose the wound on his side, and then she saw it, a deep, vicious cut. Long and jagged, it wasn't a bullet wound. It was a knife wound. A fresh wave of fear crashed over her. A knife wound meant a fight. This man wasn't just a victim of the storm. He was a part of something violent. As she poured whiskey onto the wound, the man arched his back, his eyes fluttering open for a moment. They were a startlingly clear blue, clouded with pain. He tried to speak, but only a hoarse sound escaped before he lapsed back into unconsciousness. She stitched the wound as best she could, her movements clumsy but determined. Exhausted, she finally sat back. The immediate crisis was over, but the questions remained. She had brought a violent stranger into her home, risking everything for a man she didn't know. As she looked at his face, peaceful in a way it probably rarely was, she felt a strange mix of fear and an unwelcome connection. She had saved his life, and in doing so, she had tied their fates together. She could only pray she hadn't made a terrible mistake. As she gently cleaned the mud from his chest, her fingers brushed against something rough beneath his torn shirt. It wasn't another wound. It was raised skin, scarred and deliberate. Puzzled, she pulled the fabric aside. In the dim light, she saw a brand seared into his flesh just over his heart. It was a symbol she didn't recognize, an ornate, stylized bird of prey. This wasn't the mark of a rancher. It was the mark of ownership, of belonging to something or someone. The mystery of the man on her floor had just deepened, and the feeling of danger intensified, coiling in the small cabin like a snake. The stranger slept for 2 full days. Sarah watched him, a constant, simmering anxiety in the pit of her stomach. She changed his bandages, forced broth between his lips, and slowly coaxed him back from the brink of death. Liam remained suspicious, his hand rarely straying from the small, whittling knife in his belt. Clara, her fear replaced by curiosity, would just stand and stare. On the third morning, he finally woke up. Sarah was mending a shirt when she heard a low groan. His eyes were open. The confusion was gone, replaced by a sharp, intelligent awareness. "Easy now," she said softly, moving to his side. "You've been badly hurt." His gaze swept the small cabin before landing back on her. "Where am I?" he asked, his voice raspy. "My homestead," she explained. "We found you during the storm." He looked at her for a long moment, his blue eyes taking in every detail. "I owe you my life, ma'am," he said, with a gratitude that seemed genuine. He introduced himself as Benjamin Carter, a cattleman from the north, on his way to San Antonio. His horse had thrown him in the storm, he said, injuring him in the fall. The story was plausible enough, but it didn't explain the knife wound or the brand on his chest. Sarah didn't press him. A part of her didn't want to know. Over the next few days, Benjamin began to recover. He was a model patient, charming and polite. He had a quick wit and a ready smile that seemed to light up the dark cabin. He enchanted Clara with stories and even managed to win over Liam with his knowledge of horses and cattle. A strange, almost domestic routine began to form. He would watch her as she worked, his eyes filled with an unreadable expression. He asked about her life, about John, and he listened with a quiet empathy that she found herself drawn to. For the first time in 2 years, the cabin didn't feel so empty. A dangerous seed of hope began to sprout in her heart. "When I get to San Antonio," he promised one evening, "I'll make sure you're compensated. You and your children will want for nothing. I give you my word." The promise was tantalizing, but it was the way he looked at her when he said it, with a mixture of respect and affection, that made her heart flutter. But doubt began to creep in. He claimed to be a cattleman, yet his hands were smooth, the hands of a man who had never done a day of hard labor. He talked about horses, but never once asked about his own, which should have been his first concern. And then their closest neighbor, a grizzled old rancher named Walter Hemmings, rode over for a visit. After a few pleasantries, Walter pulled her aside, his voice low. "I was in town for supplies yesterday, Sarah," he said, his eyes darting toward Benjamin. "Saw something that might interest you." He pulled out a folded, crumpled piece of paper. It was a wanted poster. Sarah's blood ran cold as she unfolded it. The sketch was crude, but the resemblance was unmistakable. The square jaw, the piercing eyes. It was Benjamin. But the name wasn't Benjamin Carter. It was the Gentleman Ghost. The bounty was a staggering $5,000. The crime, armed robbery, and the theft of a large quantity of gold from a powerful and ruthless mining magnate named Alistair Finch. Sarah's hand trembled. The expensive clothes, the smooth hands, the knife wound. It all clicked into place with a sickening finality. She looked over at Benjamin, who was laughing at something Clara had said. It was impossible to reconcile the kind, gentle man she had come to know with the dangerous outlaw on the poster. "Just be careful, Sarah," Walter warned, his eyes filled with a concern that seemed genuine. "A man like that, he brings trouble with him." After Walter left, a heavy silence fell on the cabin. She had been a fool, a lonely widow charmed by a handsome face and a silver tongue. She had harbored a fugitive in her home, putting her children in terrible danger. That night she lay awake, the thought of the bounty, a venomous snake coiling in her gut. $5,000. It was a life-changing amount of money, enough to save her homestead, to give her children a future. She could turn him in, but could she betray the man who had brought light back into her home, even if it was all a lie? She was trapped. That evening, as she was fetching water from the well, she saw them. Two sets of horseshoe prints in the soft earth near the creek, partially hidden by the bushes. They were fresh, and they didn't match the tracks from Walter's old mare. Someone else had been here. Someone else was watching them. The wanted poster became a toxic secret, souring every moment. She watched Benjamin, searching for a sign of the dangerous outlaw, but all she saw was the same considerate man who had so easily woven himself into their lives. He sensed the change in her. "Is everything all right, Sarah?" he would ask, his blue eyes filled with a concern she could no longer trust. The air in the cabin grew thick with unspoken words. The breaking point came a week later. It was a hot, still afternoon. Sarah was in the garden, listlessly pulling weeds, when Liam let out a sharp cry of alarm. Her head snapped up, her heart lurching. Four men on horseback were riding toward the cabin. They were not friendly visitors. They were rough-looking men with hard faces and the cold, dead eyes of predators. The man in the lead was tall and imposing, with a thick black beard and a cruel slash of a mouth. Her blood ran cold. The trouble Walter had warned her about had finally arrived. "Liam, get inside!" she screamed. They scrambled into the cabin, slamming the door just as the riders reined in their horses in a cloud of dust. "Benjamin!" she cried, her voice a strangled whisper. He was already on his feet, his charming demeanor gone, replaced by a cold, focused intensity. He moved to the window, peering through a crack. "Who are they?" she asked. "Not friends," he said grimly. The leader of the group dismounted, his spurs jingling. "Benjamin!" he called out, his voice a gravelly boom. "I know you're in there. Don't make this any harder than it has to be." Sarah looked at Benjamin, who gave a slight shake of his head. "We don't know anyone by that name," Sarah called out, her voice surprisingly steady. A harsh laugh came from outside. "Oh, I don't think so, ma'am. We tracked him all the way from Blackstone. Calls himself the Gentleman Ghost now, does he?" The name hit Sarah like a physical blow. They knew. "He double-crossed me and my men," the man outside continued, his voice dripping with venom. "Took something that belongs to us, a large quantity of gold. We just want it back, and a little payback for our trouble." His words confirmed her worst fears. Benjamin wasn't just a thief. He had stolen from other criminals. She hadn't just harbored a fugitive. She had stumbled into the middle of a war between thieves. Don't play dumb with me, lady. The man who she now realized must be the infamous gang leader Marcus Thorne snarled. We've been watching this place for 2 days. Send him out or we come in and get him. And you don't want us to come in. The threat hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. She looked at her children, huddled in the corner, their faces pale with terror. What do we do? She whispered to Benjamin. The mask was completely gone now. She was looking at the gentleman ghost, a man cornered and desperate. They won't leave without the gold, he said, his voice low and grim. And I don't have it with me. The realization was crushing. He had lied about everything. He had used her kindness, her loneliness, as a shield. But then Thorne called out again, and his words changed everything. Tell him I have something else of his, something he might want more than the gold. Thorne held up a small silver object that glinted in the harsh sunlight. It was a locket. Tell him I have her locket, he yelled. At the sight of it, all the color drained from Benjamin's face. The cool, calculating outlaw disappeared, replaced by a raw, visceral panic. The locket wasn't just an object, it was everything. And the choice she had been agonizing over, to turn him in or protect him, had been made for her. Their fates were now intertwined, and they would either survive this together or they would die together. The sun began to set, painting the sky in hues of orange and blood red. The siege had begun. Thorne and his men made a camp a safe distance away, their fire a malevolent, flickering eye in the darkness. They were patient. They knew they had the upper hand. The small cabin, once a sanctuary, was now a prison. Sarah sat on the floor, her arms wrapped around a sleeping Clara. Liam sat beside them, his small face a stoic mask. Benjamin paced like a caged animal. Finally, he sank down onto the floor opposite Sarah, the silence between them a chasm of unspoken accusations. Sarah, he began, his voice ragged. I am so sorry. Sorry doesn't change anything, she said, her voice flat. You lied to me. You put my children in danger. I know, he said, his voice laced with self-loathing. I never meant for this to happen. But I am involved, she snapped, her anger finally breaking through her fear. Who are you? The gentleman ghost? Is any of it true? He flinched at the name, but didn't deny it. My real name is Nathaniel Cole, he said softly. The rest? Most of it is true. I am a thief. He paused, his gaze dropping to the floor. When he looked up again, his eyes were filled with a deep, haunting sadness. But I'm not the monster they make me out to be. And then the story came tumbling out, not the smooth lies of Benjamin Carter, but the raw, painful truth of Nathaniel Cole. He was the son of a businessman from back east, a man who had been ruined by the ruthless mining magnate Alistair Finch. Finch had systematically destroyed his father, driving him to an early grave. Left with nothing but a burning desire for revenge, Nathaniel had set out to reclaim what he believed was his. The gentleman ghost was born not of greed, but of a desperate need for justice. The gold he had stolen was a shipment from one of Finch's mines, gold that Thorne and his men had been hired to transport. The brand on his chest was Finch's mark, seared into the skin of men who worked for him, a symbol of ownership. Nathaniel had once been one of them, before Finch betrayed him and destroyed his family. The locket belonged to his mother, the last thing he had of her, a memento Finch had stolen out of pure spite. I didn't just steal from Thorne, Nathaniel explained. I stole from Finch. Thorne was just a hired gun. I underestimated his greed. He looked at Sarah, his eyes pleading for understanding. I know it doesn't excuse the lies, but I want you to know I'm not a cold-blooded killer. I'm just a man who has lost everything, trying to right a terrible wrong. His confession hung in the air. Sarah looked at him, at the raw vulnerability in his eyes, and saw not an outlaw, but a man haunted by his past. The anger inside her began to recede, replaced by a grudging, unwelcome empathy. The lines between right and wrong were now hopelessly blurred. Where is the gold now? She asked quietly. I buried it, he said. A few days' ride from here. I was on my way to retrieve it when Thorne's men caught up with me. That's how I got this, he said, gesturing to his side. I managed to get away, but they killed my horse. I was lost, nearly dead, when the storm hit. Suddenly, Liam, who had been silent, spoke up. So you're not going to give them the gold? He asked, his young voice fierce. Nathaniel looked at the boy, a sad smile on his lips. No, son, I'm not. Good, Liam said, his chin held high. It's not theirs. In that moment, Sarah saw her husband and her son, the same stubborn sense of justice. A fierce, protective feeling swelled in her chest. She was no longer just a victim in this story. She was a participant. All right, she said, her voice firm, her gaze steady. What's the plan? And just as Nathaniel began to speak, Liam interrupted again. Wait, the boy said, his eyes wide. When we were dragging you inside, something fell out of your pocket. I picked it up. I hid it. He scurried to the loose floorboard under his bed and pulled out a small, oilskin pouch. Inside wasn't a map or a weapon. It was a single, intricately carved iron key. Nathaniel stared at it, a look of stunned disbelief on his face. I thought I lost it, he whispered. I thought it was gone forever. He looked from the key to Sarah. The gold is a distraction. This is the real prize. It opens a lockbox in San Antonio, a box that contains ledgers, documents, everything needed to prove Finch's crimes and bring him down for good. The game had just changed. They weren't just fighting for gold. They were fighting for justice. And the key to it all was right here in their tiny cabin. The moonless night was their only ally. Nathaniel, his energy now a focused, calculating calm, outlined the plan. It was a desperate gamble, but it was better than waiting for Thorne to storm the cabin. They're expecting us to run, he whispered. We're going to do something they don't expect. We're going to fight back. The plan was audacious. Nathaniel would create a diversion, setting fire to the small, dry woodshed. While Thorne's men were focused on the blaze, Sarah and the children would make a break for the rocky outcrop behind the cabin, a natural fortress of boulders that would offer better cover. Liam, Nathaniel said, his voice serious, man to man. I need you to guide your mother and sister to the rocks. Keep them safe. Can you do that? Liam nodded, his small frame straightening with a newfound purpose. The next few minutes were a blur of frantic preparation. Sarah packed a small bag. Nathaniel retrieved Liam's whittling knife, its blade now a deadly weapon in his hands. He moved with a quiet, deadly grace that was both terrifying and mesmerizing. This was the gentleman ghost in his element. I will draw them away, he said to Sarah, taking her hands. But you have to promise me, no matter what you hear, you don't stop. You get the children to the rocks and you stay there. What about you? She asked, her voice a tight knot of fear. A faint smile touched his lips. I'm a ghost, remember? I'm hard to catch. Then he was gone, melting into the darkness. The silence he left behind was deafening. It seemed like an eternity before they saw it, a flicker of orange light in the distance, quickly growing into a raging inferno. Now, Sarah whispered. Liam led the way, his small form moving with surprising confidence. They scrambled out the back, keeping low. They could hear shouts and curses from Thorne's camp. The diversion was working. They reached the dry creek bed, halfway to the rocks, when they heard the first gunshot. A sharp, deafening crack that echoed across the plains, followed by another, and then another. Sarah's heart leaped into her throat. Keep going, she urged Liam, her voice a harsh whisper. They scrambled up the loose shale of the outcrop, finding a small alcove between two massive boulders. They huddled together, trembling, listening to the sounds of the battle. The gunshots were sporadic, punctuated by shouts. It was impossible to tell what was happening. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, the shooting stopped. A heavy, suffocating silence descended. Sarah held her breath, straining for any sound. Had Nathaniel succeeded? Or was he lying dead in the darkness? The silence stretched on, an unbearable blanket of uncertainty. Then they heard it, the sound of a single horse riding away, its hoofbeats growing fainter until they disappeared into the vast, empty night. They waited, huddled in the cold embrace of the rocks. Had the danger passed, or was it simply lying in wait? As the first faint hint of dawn began to lighten the eastern sky, a new sound reached them. A single set of footsteps, slow and weary, approaching their hiding place. Sarah pulled Clara closer, her heart a frantic drum. A figure emerged from the pre-dawn gloom, a tall, familiar silhouette. He was limping, his clothes torn, a fresh, dark stain on his sleeve. But he was alive. "Nathaniel," Sarah breathed. He collapsed against the rocks, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He was injured, exhausted, but he was smiling, a weary, triumphant smile. "It's over," he whispered. "They're gone." He had done it. He had led them on a wild chase, outsmarting and outmaneuvering them. Thorne, his gang shattered, had fled into the night. They were safe. But as Sarah looked at the fresh wound on his arm, she knew this wasn't the end. It was just the end of a chapter. As she was about to help him, another sound stopped them cold. The slow, steady creak of wagon wheels and the soft nickering of a horse. It was coming from the direction of the road. Peering through a gap in the rocks, Sarah's blood ran cold. It was Walter, their neighbor, driving his small buckboard. But he wasn't alone. Sitting beside him, holding a rifle across his lap, was the local sheriff, a hard-faced man named Calloway. Walter wasn't coming to help. He had seen the fire, heard the gunshots, and had gone for the law. The danger wasn't gone, it had just changed its face. Sheriff Calloway was a by-the-book lawman, his face a granite mask of grim duty. He and Walter approached the rocks, their footsteps echoing in the quiet morning air. Walter pointed a trembling finger. "That's him, Sheriff, the outlaw from the poster, and she's been helping him." Calloway's eyes, cold and gray as a winter sky, settled on Nathaniel, then on Sarah and her children. The fight seemed to drain out of Nathaniel. He was out of tricks, out of time. He slowly raised his hands, but Sarah stepped forward. The fear was still there, a cold knot in her stomach, but beneath it was a bedrock of resolve she didn't know she possessed. "Sheriff," she said, her voice clear and steady, "before you do anything, you need to see this." She reached into the bag she had packed and pulled out the iron key. It looked small and insignificant in her hand. "This man's name is Nathaniel Cole. He did steal gold from Alistair Finch, but that's not the whole story." Calloway looked skeptical, his hand resting on the butt of his pistol. Sarah took a deep breath. "This key opens a lockbox in San Antonio. Inside are ledgers and documents. Proof that Finch has been running an operation that goes far beyond mining. Illegal land grabs, extortion, murder. He's been buying off politicians and lawmen all across the territory." The sheriff's expression didn't change, but a flicker of something, interest, recognition, stirred in his eyes. Walter scoffed. "Lies! She's just trying to protect her outlaw lover." "Is she?" a new voice said. They all turned. One of Thorne's men, a young outlaw with a hastily bandaged shoulder, stumbled out from behind a boulder where he'd been hiding. He was scared, defeated, and ready to talk. "It's true, Sheriff," he stammered. "Thorne wasn't just working for Finch. He was a partner. We weren't just moving gold. We were. Cleaning up messes for him. The things I've seen." His voice trailed off. That was it. The final piece. Calloway looked from the scared outlaw to Sarah, then to Nathaniel. He was an old-timer, a man who had seen the West change, had seen men like Finch poison everything they touched. He made a decision. He turned to a stunned Walter. "Walter Hemmings, you're under arrest for attempting to claim a fraudulent bounty and for obstructing a federal investigation." As his deputy, who had been waiting by the wagon, came to put Walter in cuffs, Calloway turned back to Nathaniel. "I rode out here looking for a wanted man called the Gentleman Ghost. According to this witness," he said, nodding at Thorne's man, "the Ghost was killed in a firefight last night with his own partners over a split of gold. A real tragedy." He looked Nathaniel dead in the eye. "I never saw you. Now get out of my territory, and don't ever come back." He tipped his hat to Sarah. "Ma'am." Then he turned and walked away, leaving them in the stunning, silent aftermath. Justice had arrived, not with a blaze of glory, but with the quiet, world-weary decision of one good man. Nathaniel was free, but now he was truly a ghost. He had to leave. He turned to Sarah, his gaze filled with unspoken words. "The key," he said, pressing it into her hand. "It's for you. The lockbox also contains a deed. Your husband, John." He was my contact. He was helping me gather the proof against Finch. The money Finch paid him, he used it to buy a small, successful ranch near San Antonio. A new start for you and the children. It's clean, Sarah. It's yours. The final twist was the most shocking of all. John hadn't been just a simple farmer who died of a fever. He had been a quiet hero, fighting a silent war. And his death, Nathaniel now suspected, was no accident. He had gotten too close to the truth. Nathaniel's arrival hadn't brought the trouble to her door. The trouble had been there all along, a shadow she never knew existed. He leaned in and kissed her, a slow, tender farewell that was a promise, a thank you, and a final goodbye all in one. Then he turned and walked away without looking back, a lonely silhouette against the rising sun. Sarah watched until he vanished. The cabin behind her was scarred and empty, but it was not the same hopeless emptiness as before. The story of the poor widow and the gentleman outlaw didn't end with them riding off into the sunset. It ended with a sunrise, a key, and a choice. Sarah O'Connell was no longer a victim. She was a survivor. The storm had passed and a new, uncertain, but hopeful dawn was just beginning. The story of Sarah O'Connell and the Gentleman Ghost reminds us that heroes and villains are not always who they seem. It's a tale of how one single act of kindness, one choice to open a door during a storm, can change the entire course of a life. It's about the incredible courage found in desperation, the love that can bloom in the most barren of landscapes, and the ghosts of the past that are never truly buried. What happened to Nathaniel Cole? Did Sarah and her children make it to that new ranch? Some stories don't have neat and tidy endings, and perhaps that's where their true power lies, in the questions they leave behind. If this journey into the heart of the Wild West moved you, if you felt the dust on your face and the tension in the air, then please show your support. Hit that like button, share this story with someone who loves a good old-fashioned drama, and most importantly, subscribe for more tales that prove the human spirit is the most untamed frontier of all.